Veritas. SCP Files. Bonus Episode 3: Feast or Famine. Okay, so I know I don't have to do this, but after the report on the Carnivorous Blanket, SCP-799, I was so curious what the anomaly could do when it was actually hungry. Don't get me wrong. I'm always very happy when a report ends with no injuries and no deaths. It's not like I want people to be injured, and I definitely don't want to read about it. It's just, when you start wondering whether or not an object as mundane as a blanket might be deadly, then you start avoiding things in life. It's almost winter. I have to be able to use blankets without that worry constantly clutching at the back of my mind. So, I thought it high time I revisit 799 and see if I can find any new information that can help me distinguish an actual blanket from a man-eating anomaly. To that end, Niall has provided me with access to a restricted incident report involving an abandoned test into the anomalies. I was just going to read the ones I had clearance for, but he insisted. So, for the record, this was not entirely my idea. Incident 799-12. 12th known incident related to SCP-799, colloquially known as the Carnivorous Blanket. Incident occurred during planned testing. Potential risks and losses considered acceptable. Object Class: Euclid. Risk Assessment Level: Low. Reported by Senior Researcher Roger Malcolm. Report made July 24th, 2018. It figures that all this would result in me writing up an incident report instead of a termination log or a containment plan update. We're the SCP Foundation for a reason. We secure the anomalies, lock them away as best we can, and keep them out of sight and out of civilian hands. We don't destroy them unless we have no other choice, and we sure as hell don't use them to roll the dice and pretend we're gods. Because this is the sort of thing that always happens when we stray from our philosophy of containment first. I want it on record that I was against this from the beginning. Just because we can alter or destroy something doesn't mean we should. When we start messing around with the anomalous properties of these objects just because we can, when we veer off course this hard, that's when things start going wrong. Call me crazy. Call me a conspiracy theorist, as some people in the office sure do. But I think this whole project was just the beginning of something bigger. Someone wants to know how to modify the anomalies, how to tame them and leash them permanently. Maybe even weaponize them. And what better test subject than a stationary blanket that can't walk away on its own? When the orders came down to start tweaking the Carnivorous Blanket's DNA, trying to isolate the genes that trigger the hunger and feeding response, I knew we were pushing into dangerous territory. You ever see those horror movies where they run a gene editing experiment on some carnivore, and surprise, surprise, it starts hunting with new, impossible to escape tricks? We know how these things turn out. If only gene editing was as easy as it looks in movies, though. The quick, snap-of-the-finger science that makes monsters on demand with the exact traits you want. Real gene editing, though, is a lot more tedious. Using CRISPR, we isolated the gene sequence which we were pretty sure was responsible for the blanket's appetite response. Wait. Actually, you aren't a scientist, right? This report is definitely going to be reviewed by security. Okay, let me backtrack and explain. CRISPR, that's spelled CRISPR, works like a set of microscopic scissors. We target the specific DNA sequence that regulates a behavior of interest and suppress certain genes. After careful study of the blanket's feeding patterns, we managed to isolate the gene that seems to trigger it to transform from docile blanket into frenzied predator. And then we disabled it, hoping to reduce the blanket's response to heat, proximity, and motion. But of course, genetic code isn't always straightforward. Interfering with one gene can just cause other traits to start surfacing. The whole system gets pushed out of balance. In the initial trials, we took a lab rat and let it loose near a hungry and underfed blanket. We watched it sniff and explore the edges of the wool. The blanket lay still and unmoving despite the scent of fresh meat and what was undoubtedly the tantalizing heat radiating from the rat's body. No triggers, no fuss. Where once its surface would ripple with pulsing anticipation, teeth pushing unseen from the fabric's innermost threads, waiting for its prey to wander closer, waiting for the right time to strike and tear. Now it lay dormant, unmoving. Even when the rat finally pushed its face into the soft black folds and disappeared underneath it, the blanket merely billowed up around it, and the rat left the other side unscathed. We all, even I, thought the predator might finally be at rest, eternally dormant, doomed to waste away without ever feeding again. But then the D-class trial began. We selected a young man, D7344. He was a calm, unassuming man in his mid-20s who spoke with such a quiet tone that I almost wondered if he felt any fear at all going into such a dangerous test. He didn't like being chosen, of course, but he didn't put up even a word of protest when we told him what was expected of him. He was to wrap himself in the blanket every day and sit, for the entire 8 hours of our shifts, in a dimly lit room in a plain armchair, and conduct basic cataloging, maintenance tasks, and safety checks on a series of mundane equipment. Basic, tedious tasks that required only a few movements, and we warned him that this was very much intentional. Sudden motion might still yet trigger the blanket's sensitivity. It may be dormant, but we didn't know if it would stay that way, or for how long. Every morning, D7344 would carefully and delicately lift the carnivore from the chair and wrap it loosely around his shoulders. He would sit delicately, ensuring that he did not pinch or trap any part of the creature. And then he would peacefully and tranquilly thumb through his manuals or look over the equipment, moving so smoothly we all marveled at his composure. In fact, his peacefulness began to put us all at ease. The quiet had a way of making us forget the danger that lay coiled beneath the blanket's stillness. It seemed the blanket wasn't going to make any further moves. It seemed as though there was nothing to fear. It started so subtly. On day 3, D7344 began to scratch. At first, it was just a faint, almost absent-minded motion, his fingers lightly brushing over his arms, chest, or sides, as if swatting away invisible bugs. But as the hours and then days passed, the scratching grew more intense. He began to rake his nails across his skin, slow and deliberate, leaving long, red streaks in their wake. Strange welts began to form, appearing almost like bug bites. Clusters of tiny, itchy bumps that cascaded across his body. It was as if there were millions of microscopic mites hidden in the fabric, each one nibbling a little more each day, leaving behind a rash of angry red hives. On day 6, we noticed that 7344 was losing weight. He reported no changes in his eating habits, and he still sat down for lunch each day with the blanket wrapped around his shoulders, eating quietly, slowly, and without complaint. But each morning, the number on the scale seemed to creep lower and lower as his muscles began to waste away before our eyes. By day 8, the fatigue had set in. He moved slower, his posture slumping even from the first moments he entered the testing chamber each day. It was subtle at first, just a slight drag in his steps, a moment's hesitation before responding to commands. But after only a few days more, he was barely able to keep his eyes open. At times, he would nod off in the chair, his head drooping towards his chest. And then, on day 10, he finally did fall fully asleep. He came in as usual, his painfully thin limbs red and raw, covered in open, weeping sores that made him wince in pain whenever he moved to scratch at them. Even still, he didn't argue, didn't put up a moment's fight about wrapping that blanket around his bony shoulders. Every time the wool brushed against his rash, he would wince and cry out softly, shifting and moving around, seeking comfort in any way he was able. The pain of his wounds, though an uncomfortable constant backdrop now to his life, did not seem enough to keep him awake. We watched him nod off yet again, and this time, when his head dropped, he started to lean sideways. In total silence, the chair began to tilt, and the blanket stiffened as though in anticipation. D7344 snapped awake just in time to keep from toppling, his eyes wide and frantic. He jolted sideways, counterbalancing the lean of his chair, and the blanket rippled in response, twitching along his body in a pulse of agitation, protesting the sudden movement. The prisoner screamed, lurching to his feet and grabbing at the material that clung to his arms, attempting to pull it from his body. I exhaled sharply through my teeth. I hadn't noticed it before, as the blanket had always been neatly folded on the chair or wrapped around him. But now, when he stood up fully, and they moved and swelled together as it clung to his emaciated form, it was quite noticeably bigger than before. Much bigger. Whereas once it had barely wrapped around him, it now hung nearly to the floor. And as it continued pulsing, it began to slither across his limbs, wrapping down towards his feet and climbing up towards his neck. He thrashed against it, grabbing at the plush wool and ripping with all his might, screaming ever louder as a sickening, wet tearing rent the air. The blanket was not fully in its predatorial form. We saw no evidence of its previous behavior. It did not bite out huge chunks of his flesh. We saw no glistening fangs to tear or slice away at him. But in that dim, flickering light, I swear to you that the material of that blanket had changed. Out of the silky wool slid thousands upon thousands of long, needle-like protrusions, which hooked into his skin as the blanket contorted itself around him, sinking into the sides of his neck and sliding up onto his face. We looked on in horror as it crawled over his screaming mouth, and in less than a minute, the two were nothing more than a misshapen organic mass writhing on the floor. "10 days. It took that blanket 10 days to fully consume him. The thrashing continued for the first 2.5, before it finally lay still and simply pulsed. No more quick slurification. No more feeding in a messy, bloody tear that grants a merciful, fast death. We have managed to create a predator that appears just like an ordinary blanket, that slowly, over the course of many, many hours, sucks the nutrients from your body, bit by bit, until you are too weak to fight back when it finally chooses to engulf you. And all the while, it appears as a simple, harmless, everyday blanket. I'll say it again. We are fools. Whoever ordered this test is a fool. I don't care how high-ranking they are. If this research serves any purpose at all, I hope it's an end to the gene editing tests. I will not be dragged into another one. This was a disaster, and it was always going to be a disaster. In the end, we have forgotten what makes SCPs dangerous in the first place. It's not just the hunger of a carnivorous anomaly that's deadly. It's the hubris of those who think they can control it, change it, or tame it. We are so desperate to find a quick solution, to prove we can fix things, that we lose sight of what should be a glaringly obvious truth. Some things are meant to remain as they are, untouched, untampered with, forever. Secure, contain, and protect. Anything more will only ever lead to ruin. I hope whoever ordered this test never forgets that. I sure won't. And I sure as hell will be checking every blanket I ever use from here on out. So, far from relieving my anxiety, I think that's actually worsened it. I'm not sure if Niall intended that to be the case, or if he was just trying to warn me that my fear was not misplaced. Either way, I guess I will continue to be wary around blankets. And wary around the reports that he hands me. Sometimes I think these things would be better off left unknown.
Vault Veritas SCP Files is a podcast inspired by the SCP Foundation. Feast or Famine is based on SCP-799 by Photosynthetic from the SCP Wiki located at scp-wiki.com/SCP-799. It is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike 3.0 unported license. This episode was performed by Justin Gellner, and it was written and edited by Leola Angel. We welcome comments. Please email us at vaultveritas@gmail.com. Join our Discord channel using the link in the episode description. Or if you'd like, visit our Patreon, listed as Vault Veritas SCP Files. Thanks for listening.